Welcome to this webinar, Creating Readers, the Science of Teaching Children to Read in English. I'm Dr. Julia B. Lindsay, and I'm thrilled to be able to join you to talk about teaching children to read in English and how to support your child or students in using research-based techniques in the earliest stages of reading. Before we get started, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Julia Lindsay, and I am a foundational skills expert who supports schools and districts across the United States in leveraging research to improve reading outcomes. I began my career as an elementary school teacher and then went on to get my master's degree in elementary education and my PhD in literacy education. My research focuses on foundational literacy instruction, in particular, the teacher curriculum, the practices, and the materials like books that are going to best serve children in becoming great readers. I'm also the author of Reading Above the Fray, the first book in Scholastic's The Science of Reading in Practice line that seeks to help teachers use research to improve literacy instruction. I'm honored to be here to share with you some about reading in English. Before we get started, I want to make sure that you know that today we are going to primarily focus on the basics of how children learn to read words. We're not going to spend a ton of time diving into how children understand text in this webinar. Today, our time together will be split into 3 parts. We will begin with a little bit of background information about what skills are necessary to read in English and how individuals really learn to read. Then we will discuss some information about how we teach reading here in the US. We'll focus on some recent trends connected to the research and how these trends are improving reading. And finally, we'll end with 4 clear strategies and activities to support reading at home or at school. Let's go ahead and get into our first section. How does English reading happen? We're going to begin with an overview of English. I'm going to focus on a few key facts about written English that are really critical to understanding and keeping in mind when we're teaching children to read. The first key fact to know about written English is that it directly transcribes oral language or sounds into letters. In other words, written English represents sounds, which then come together to become words that we can then connect to meanings. For example, in the word you see at the top of the screen, the letters C-A-T represent the sounds cat. Together, these sounds blend into the word cat, which of course means that furry little animal that might live in somebody's house that likes to drink milk and curl up in the sun. Thus, letters represent sounds, which represent words. A second key fact that's important to know about English is that there are 44 or so possible sounds or phonemes, depending on your dialect and your accent. An example of a sound or a phoneme is the k sound at the beginning of that word cat. In Korean, there are only 28 sounds. Some of these sounds are overlapping with English and some are not. Therefore, when children are learning to read in English, they are also going to need to learn some new sounds. In a perfect world, there would also be 44 ways to spell these sounds. But unfortunately, that's not how English operates, which brings us to our third key fact. Our third key fact about English is that the correspondences between letters and sounds mostly follow predictable patterns or rules. For example, in that word cat, we would never think that was spelled with the letter P, but English has what we call a deep orthography, which means that there's not a direct one-to-one correspondence between these sounds and letters. Some sounds can be spelled by several different letters or combinations of letters, and some letters or combinations of letters can actually spell multiple sounds. Let's take a look at an example. In this example, the k sound we hear at the beginning of a word like cat or the end of a word like cat can actually be spelled 5 different ways, with the letter C, the letters CK, the letter K, the letters CH, or the letters Q, U, E. The spelling for that sound in different words is based on several different elements, including things like the position of that sound in a word, the surrounding letters, in particular the vowels, and even the word's origin, among some other issues as well. This might make English seem so confusing that it isn't particularly worth it to teach children about any rules or patterns of how oral English sounds connect to these written letters. But that sound certainly cannot be spelled with a letter like B. And knowing this, as well as much more specific patterns, is essential for early readers to have success. Indeed, to learn to read in English, children must connect how the sounds of oral English connect to the spellings in English. The instruction that we use to teach these connections between sounds and letters is called phonics. Many, many decades of high-quality research have consistently demonstrated that an explicit, systematic approach to teaching children the connections between sounds and letters through phonics is the most efficient, effective way to teach children to read. In other words, when we teach children in a logical order how English letters or combinations of letters are connected to sounds in a direct, clear way, we see that children are on the most efficient and effective path to learn how to read and to become great readers. Another way that we can think about this is by considering what is reading? What goes into this? The model that you can see on this slide is called the simple view of reading. Though this model is a little bit old for research, it's from the 1980s, it has been validated in many studies in the last 4 decades and holds tremendously powerful truths about reading. Over the last 4 decades, researchers have taken additional looks at this view and have consistently demonstrated that it does tell us quite a lot about reading, even though it seems pretty simple. In this view, we see that reading comprehension, or understanding what we read, which is of course the goal of reading, is the result of both decoding and language comprehension. And this view chose to represent this process with multiplication on purpose, to demonstrate that if either of these, decoding or language comprehension, is 0 or at nothing, then there will be no reading comprehension. In other words, the simple view shows us a very simple but very critical point about reading. We need to be able to both recognize or decode the words and understand the words in order to really be able to comprehend. We can't just be good at one or the other. We need to be good at both. This model is really helpful because it reminds us that we cannot just teach children a whole lot of information about letters and sounds to get them to become readers. But we also cannot just expose children to oral language and to lots and lots of English and think that they will read that way either. Children need support and instruction in both of these areas to have the highest likelihood of being a proficient reader. We're going to take a deeper dive into each of the 2 elements of the simple view to talk about what these really mean. The first that we'll dive into is decoding. Decoding means using the knowledge of sounds and letters to read a word. Remember our example about that word cat? When I look at the word cat and say, oh, C spells, A spells cat, T spells, and altogether that spells cat, I'm demonstrating the act of decoding. In other words, decoding is when children list the letters off the page, say the individual sounds, and then create a word. Decoding requires several steps. First, you need to match letters to individual sounds. So you look at a page and see an individual letter or combination of letters and are able to match that to a sound. Second, you need to be able to actually say those sounds and pronounce them in a way that is accurate enough that you are able to figure out what sound you're saying. Third, You need to put all of those sounds back together to say an entire word. And finally, when we're reading a real word, especially when we're reading a real word inside of a sentence or a book that we're trying to understand, we also need to connect that word we've read to its meaning. We can't just stop and say dog if we have absolutely no idea what the meaning of dog is. We need both sides, recognizing what a word is using its letters and sounds and understanding what that vocabulary word means. Decoding requires children to have certain sets of skills and knowledge. First, it requires children to understand something we call print concepts, or the ability to navigate a text. Children need to know, what is a word? Where do I find them? And what direction do I read in order to be able to engage with written language? Second, it requires children to use phonemic awareness, or their ability to hear and say each small sound in language. And finally, it requires knowledge about what those little sounds match to each letter. Children then bring these pieces of knowledge together to be able to decode words. And as they're decoding a word, then they leverage that knowledge of vocabulary to understand what that word means. When combined together, this act of actually saying individual sounds and smushing them back together to make a word and then matching that to vocabulary is how children best store knowledge of words in long-term memory. When children repeat this action over and over again, they create what we call orthographic maps, which are long-term storage units for individual words and for patterns in language. This is what allows a child to be able to read words automatically, which allows them to be a fluent reader who is a successful reader who understands a lot of what they read. So let's think about all the knowledge that a children is bringing just to read even a simple sentence. When a young child is just learning English, they need to decode each word. In other words, they need to carefully match each letter or letter combination to sounds, put the sounds together, say the word, and then, particularly for children new to English, they need to match that word to a meaning. This slide has some examples of the knowledge that children need even to read words that seem relatively simple. If a child comes up to a word like this, they need to know that T and H are unlikely to be making the sounds that we talk about in the alphabet, but in fact are representing a new sound. If we take a look at a word like nice, children need to recognize that the E on the end of that word is going to influence that the middle I is probably not an I sound, but is likely an I sound, and that C is likely making a sound. If they get to a word like dog, they need to understand and be able to use the knowledge that D spells D, O spells A, and G spells G, and then put those sounds back together, D-og, dog, and say the whole word. In other words, decoding is very hard work. It may, in fact, feel extraordinarily tedious. Even just to hear me model those examples might seem like a very tedious endeavor. And when we're sitting with young children who are working on this process, it might feel very tedious indeed. And it might not really feel like it's worth it to help a child through this act that is so difficult. After all, it may seem a lot easier to get children to memorize some words instead, in particular, some of the words that I just showed that seem very easy and basic. But actually, research shows that learning to decode words, practicing decoding those words, and using that skill in books is far more efficient and effective for developing into a proficient reader than teaching children to memorize words or just exposing children to books. To ensure that children have the highest likelihood of being great readers, we have to teach them to decode words, no matter how hard it is. Before we move into our second section, let's quickly pause and think about that second major part of reading, language comprehension. Though we're focused on decoding today, it's important that we never forget about the comprehension side of reading, in particular when we're supporting someone who is learning English for the first time. Though it's important to focus on decoding too, we need to remember that it isn't the only thing children need to become readers. To understand a book, you need a lot of other pieces of knowledge and skills. You need to understand the individual words and what they mean, or the vocabulary. You need to be able to make sense of sentences and language structures. You need to be able to make some kind of connection to the content through background knowledge, whether that be through something you've experienced in your life or something that you've learned in school or in another book. And you need to be able to follow the context and the genre, understanding how these literary structures create a text. Many of these skills that are related to language comprehension are built through learning to speak and converse in English, and learning about the world and learning about text in general. We, of course, want children to make sense of what they've read. So just as we bring some conversation and precision about decoding to our conversation today, I hope you'll also think carefully about how you can support children's language too as they learn English. As we come to the close of our first section, I want to leave you with one key takeaway. Learning to read does not tend to happen by accident. In other words, learning to read doesn't just happen because we want it to, or because children are exposed to a lot of a language, or even just because they're exposed to a lot of books. Learning to read actually requires an incredible amount of support and precision. Indeed, the human brain did not evolve to be able to read. It is taught to be able to read. So when we are thinking about helping our young children become readers, we need to bring care to our instruction and support as well. Let's get into the second part of our session, where we'll explore how we teach reading in the USA. There is actually a massive trend and change happening in the United States right now. In recent years, schools have begun to rapidly adjust their approach to teaching early reading to focus on teaching decoding. This shift is due to a number of factors, including pressure from parents, policymakers, educators, and researchers, as well as acknowledgments of needs in older children that can be solved by using research to drive decoding instruction in these early years. This trend is called the science of reading. The science of reading refers to a large body of evidence about what reading is, how it develops, and how to teach it. This body of evidence comes from multiple arenas of research from at least the past 6 decades, including neuroscientific research, psychological research, and education research. It includes knowledge that we've gained from experimental studies, from studies inside laboratories, from new technology like scanning brains with fMRI imaging, and also from studies that have been done in classrooms. The science of reading is taking most of the English-speaking world by storm, and we see conversations and trends about the science of reading in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, to name a few. And educators, parents, and others are becoming more aware of the depth of research that is available that can inform how we teach children to read. By leaning on this research, we can be far more efficient and far more effective. We can address specific needs much sooner and with better techniques. And we can better prepare all future readers for whatever endeavors they have in their future. The science of reading is sometimes described as a movement, and it's really more than just an interesting trend. This is a map that depicts all of the states that have taken up legislation related to the science of reading, or SOR. As you can see depicted in the map, 38 states and the District of Columbia have passed science of reading laws. Many of these laws mandate new ways teachers should approach teaching reading. They also mandate new curriculum and assessments that align with what research shows us about reading. Almost all of these laws also include mandates around training or retraining teachers to ensure that everyone understands the research behind decoding and how to teach decoding in a way that it will best serve students. Many of these laws also support other reading instruction that is described in research in that comprehension side as well. In the past, many classrooms in the United States taught some aspects of phonics and taught children to use context to estimate words. In other words, if a child was trying to read the sentence, "I see a horse," and instead they read, "I see a pony," a teacher might not have corrected them. They may have said, "You did great. You understood what this meant." Because reading comprehension is the ultimate goal of reading, because our ultimate goal is making sense of a text, sometimes that might make us think that we should jump straight to making meaning. But by cutting corners in decoding development, we are actually not serving children's long-term needs. And when you read, "I see a pony" instead of "I see a horse," you are in fact wrong. Though it might not seem like a big deal in the earliest stages of reading, this mistake can cascade and can become a lot harder to correct as children get older and as words get far more complex. Now in the US, however, classrooms have shifted and are focused on using research-tested and research-proven techniques to help children read words via decoding. In other words, classrooms in the US are focused on having children understand how letters represent sounds and how to use these to read individual words and to read words in books. This ensures that all children are actually reading words and are therefore more likely to store these words in long-term memory and to become fluent readers. Recall from our first section that we talked about the elements of decoding and all of the things that we need to do in order to decode a word. These represent the elements that are a focus of instruction in the United States. Instruction in the US in early reading now focuses on several areas. Don't forget that in addition to these areas, research also shows that we need to focus on supporting children's language and reading comprehension. And in classrooms in the US, teachers do spend a lot of time directly building children's language and knowledge of the world. But when we think about decoding instruction, understanding how to actually read individual words, instruction is now focusing on several areas. First, teachers provide lots of explicit, systematic instruction and introductions to sound, letters, and words. In this case, the words explicit and systematic have very specific meaning. When instruction is explicit, it means that we're directly telling children what they need to know. For example, a teacher might tell her students, "P spells the sound," instead of reading a story about penny pockets and asking children what sound they think P makes. Systematic also has a very specific definition. In this case, it means that we are following a logical progression or scope and sequence of letter-sound relationships. That typically looks like first teaching children how each letter of the alphabet is formed, what its name is, and the sound it most commonly represents. Then moving into combinations of letters, both of consonants and of vowels that represent the same or new sounds. Along this way, children are also reading more and more complex words. They often start by reading words that have only 2 or 3 letters, and do not necessarily move into reading multisyllabic words until they are in the 2nd year of reading instruction. So children move along this logical progression to ensure that they have exposure, knowledge, and practice with these critical skills. Second, instruction includes copious supported practice of both decoding and spelling. Decoding is if, of course, we're looking at a word and we're saying the sound and then saying the whole word. Spelling is pretty much the opposite. It's when we say a word, hear each sound, and then represent those sounds with a written spelling or letter. We know that we need children to practice both of these aspects of language in order to solidify their skills in reading. So many English classrooms have children practicing both. Notice that I didn't say children are practicing memorizing spelling words and having tests on those spelling words. That practice is unfortunately not in alignment with how children learn to read words. So in most US classrooms, it is no longer a part of instruction. Third, children experience lots of texts that are designed to support decoding. In most classrooms that are teaching children to decode words, after children experience some instruction and get the chance to practice with individual letters, individual words, or in very short sentences, children then read books that allow them to practice all of these skills. The exciting thing about this type of instruction is that it is superior to other approaches. Teaching children to decode is more likely to lead to fluent reading in the long term, is actually preventative of some reading difficulties that children may experience, and is necessary for many children to succeed at all in reading. So, research continually demonstrates that this type of instruction is superior to other ways of trying to teach children to read words. Our key takeaway from this section is around the United States instruction, which is that we have rapidly moved to prioritize decoding instruction as it is scientifically proven to be the best way for human brains to process and store knowledge of written English words. And by leveraging this type of instruction in classrooms, we can be more confident that children will become proficient readers. Before we move into our third section, we have an extra little bit to this second section. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about multilingual readers. If your child speaks or reads more than one language in addition to English, they are a multilingual reader. The most critical thing to know about multilingual readers is well summarized by this quotation from Dr. Kenneth Pugh, a psychology and linguistics professor at both the University of Connecticut and Yale University. He says, "There is presently no evidence that how we teach reading should be any different based on brain differences between bilingual and monolingual learners." In other words, there is nothing different about teaching someone to read who knows multiple languages. The ingredients of reading are the same. Sometimes we might need to spend more or less time on certain elements, depending on what a child already knows and the strengths that they are bringing from other languages. However, the act of reading doesn't change, and the underlying elements of reading also do not change. So, we see that we want to focus on similar instructional strategies, no matter if a child is monolingual, as in they only know one language, bilingual, as in they know 2 languages, or multilingual, as in they know many languages. Let's dive into a few additional takeaways from research about multilingual learners. First, research does show that when multilingual children are taught using an explicit phonics approach, their reading in English does improve. In other words, just as we would expect instruction in letters and sounds and how to use those to both read and spell words to help children who only know English, we also see that this type of instruction helps children who know multiple languages. Second, we further see in research that children's skills in other languages are likely to support their acquisition of English skills. In other words, these foundational reading skills transfer to English from children's first languages. As children learn more about reading in Korean, whether that's at home or at school, we would expect to see their ability to acquire skills in English to also expand, because many of these skills are cross-linguistic. In other words, they help us read in multiple languages. Thus, our key takeaway is that multilingual children benefit from the same approaches that we see work with monolingual children, research-based phonics instruction. And it's important to remember that knowledge from a child's first language does help them learn to read in English. So children's knowledge of Korean will support their abilities to read in English. Let's jump into our third and final section. In this last section, we'll explore a few key ways that you can support reading at home or at school. We have talked a lot about decoding today. To get children to decode words, we want to give them help in 4 key areas. First, they need the skills to put sounds together. Children have to be able to work with the sounds of English in order to be able to use those sounds in connection to letters to read words. Second, they need knowledge about how these sounds connect to letters. So they need to understand not just sounds in isolation, but sounds connected to the letters. Third, they need lots of practice decoding words and also spelling words with those sound letter connections that they've just learned. This kind of practice is typically best when it's just one word at a time. And finally, they need a lot of chances to decode words in books. In other words, in addition to practice with just one word at a time, children need the chance to practice using these same skills inside a full book. We're going to talk about an activity example and a little bit of additional information about each of these areas. I will also point you to a few extra resources. Our first category is practice with sounds. Children need practice with English sounds. Hearing, saying, and manipulating sounds is called phonemic awareness. This term might be really useful to you if you are trying to Google additional activities. Our goal here is to help children listen for individual sounds in language, to put those sounds together to say words orally, and then to take them apart. This section is all about oral sounds. It might seem a little weird that we're talking about types of activities that are only about oral language when we're really talking about reading. But remember, at the beginning of our time together, we talked about how written English is really representing oral sounds. And these oral sounds are truly the basis of written English. We see consistently in research that work with phonemic awareness for these individual sounds is critical for children's success in learning to read. So we want to give children the opportunity to play with sound. Let's take a look at an example activity with sounds from Florida State University. You can find more free resources from Florida State University at fcrr.org. This is their free repository of reading resources. You'll need to navigate the site a little bit to find the right age range and type of activities for your child. But once you're there, you're going to see lots of free PDF downloads that you can take a look at. This example is called Sound Train. In this example, students are sorting objects by initial sounds into a train. Now, if you don't want to print this out, that's a-okay. You can grab some toys in your child's room, or you could even rip out pictures from magazines to use. The general idea behind Sound Train is that we're listening for the first sound in words and then putting them in some kind of order or category. For example, we might be listening for the first sound in a word like toothbrush or tiger or pen, and recognize that they all start with the same sound, so they form a train. If we don't want to form a train, we can just put them in buckets or categories. By engaging in practice like this with language, with our children, working on just one sound at a time, the first sound in words, the last sound in words, and oftentimes the middle vowel, we are helping them hear and differentiate these sounds so that it's easier for them to connect these sounds with letters. This might seem a little intimidating if you don't feel 100% confident with each of these sounds in English. But the great news about this kind of activity is that you can actually support this skill in Korean. Research shows that this ability in Korean or English predicts English reading ability. So you can do the same activity with Korean sounds and words, and you can support the transfer of this skill into English. Our second category is teaching letter-sound correspondences, or directly explaining how letters connect the sounds in a systematic manner. The first thing that we want to teach children about English letters is the alphabet. When we teach the alphabet, we want to teach it in a logical order. It's totally okay to teach the alphabet in alphabetic order, or A, B, C, all the way to Z. You can also find other examples of scopes and sequences for teaching the alphabet in resources like my book, Reading Above the Fray. When we are teaching the alphabet, we want to teach children three key things. What is the name of that letter? What does this letter look like, or what is its form? And what is the sound? On the screen, you'll see an example routine that is designed for classroom teachers, but that you can absolutely use at home, where we are teaching children about those three elements and then practicing those three elements. Children need lots of opportunities to connect a letter's form or the letter that they see on a page with the sound that it makes and the name of that letter in order to solidify this knowledge. So don't be afraid to do lots of practice. It might be practice just seeing English words out in the environment. It might be practice seeing English words on TV shows or movies or in books. Anytime you can help your child look at a letter and say its sound is a great opportunity to strengthen this skill. Indeed, some researchers use protocols where children are practicing connecting the letter's form to its sound over 65 times in 15 minutes. So we're talking about tons and tons of practice. When you're introducing sounds and letters, you might want to say something like this. This is the letter B. Let's say B together. The letter B makes the sound B. Or you might prefer the language the letter B spells the sound B, because that is slightly more accurate. But pick language that feels good to you. Then you can practice making that B sound together while you point at a B in a book, or a flashcard with a B on it, or a B that you see on a street sign. One additional resource I'd like to share with you is an example of American English pronunciation of each of these sounds. This resource is a YouTube video put up by the Rollins Center in Atlanta that is a center designed for children with speech and language needs. And it has a great example of very precise sounds. You can use this video to practice the sound yourself, or you might want to use it along with your child to practice the sounds. This is going to be helpful for both our first section, practice with sounds, and teaching the letter-sound relationship. Let's look at our third category, practicing reading and spelling words. The main thing to know before we dive into that activity is that we want to make sure we are only practicing words that children have learned the letter sounds for. In other words, we don't want to accidentally give our child something that's way too hard. We want to give them the chance to practice the skill that they just learned so that they can solidify that knowledge. When we're practicing reading and spelling words, our main goal is to provide tons of activities to practice reading and spelling words with that new letter sound. It sounds pretty simple, and it is. These activities don't need to be super unique. We can just do things like practicing reading lists of words or practicing spelling words that include something we've just taught. For example, if we've just taught our child that the letter P can spell the sound, we might have them practice reading and writing words like pig or pen. One big activity that we use a lot in the United States is called word ladders. This is also called word chaining, making words, building words. It has many names. This type of activity has actually been studied in research and demonstrated to improve children's decoding. In this activity, children first write one word, such as the word rush, and then they change one sound or letter of that word to create a new word. In this case, change the R to an N, so they now write the word mush. Then they continue changing along this ladder. Change the U to an A. Now they have mash. When children are engaged in this kind of process, where they're, instead of writing just every word in order, they are actually having to change the word. They are engaging their ability to hear and manipulate sounds, as well as their understanding of letters. And this attention to multiple aspects of what we need to know to decode words means that children are getting really high quality practice. This example on the screen is from a web television show called Read, Write, Roar, which is a resource developed by the state of Michigan and PBS, which is our public broadcasting service in the United States. And you are welcome to look this up and see if you can access these resources. Our final category and final activity to try at home is to try decodable texts. Decodable texts are books that are going to support your child in reading words that they can actually decode, which means that they're getting the chance to take that practice out of the space of individual sounds, individual letters, and individual words into actual books, taking them one step closer to becoming a reader. Decodable books are books that are written to match a sequence of teaching phonics so that most or all of the words are words a child can decode. They are not just easy books. Let's take a look at these two examples for a child who's learning to read 3-letter, 3-sound words like cat. The top example is a decodable text. Bud hid in a box. He is sad. Rob is mad at him. You see that all of the words are very simple, but they're also all words with just 2 or 3 letters and 2 or 3 sounds. Each of the letters is representing its most common sound. The second book is not an example of a decodable, even though it seems just as easy. There is an owl in the woods. There is an owl in the tree. This book actually has a lot of very hard elements for a child who's just learning the basics. Words like there, woods, and owl are actually quite hard to read because you need to know more information about the sounds vowels can make. So that is not a decodable text for a child who's just learning to read three-letter words with three sounds. At home, you can get decodable text. Some you might be able to try from Scholastic. You can also look at my website called Beyond Decodable for some free resources. This website is accessible across the entire world and is completely free to use and download. You'll be able to see little books that tell you exactly what letter sound knowledge a child needs to know to be able to read the book. Then you can help your child use the act of decoding to read words instead of asking them to guess or to use context. To learn to read, children must use their knowledge of things like he spells b to read and spell. This practice is critical for their learning and for their success. So our key takeaway from our third section is that you can support decoding at home by teaching your child about letters and sounds and by having them practice in lots of different ways. We've come to the end of our time together, so I'd like to make sure to point you to a few resources. If you'd like to learn more, I suggest continuing to follow Scholastic and their learning opportunities as they continue to help you learn about teaching reading. You're also welcome to join me on Instagram or any social media platform other than TikTok, or to read my book, Reading Above the Fray. And finally, I suggest that you check out US teaching websites like Reading Rockets that are free to access and include lots of information about how to teach reading. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Again, if you're looking to connect, my name is Dr. Julia B. Lindsay, and I'm available at Julia B. Lindsay pretty much everywhere, as well as at my two websites, juliablindsay.com and beyonddecodables.com. You can find my book, Reading Above the Fray, through Scholastic, where I'm sure you'll also find more materials and opportunities to continue to learn about how we can help create great readers of English. Thank you.